Welcome, everybody, and thank you very much for coming. It's wonderful to see so many able to get away from their work life for at least one day, which is great, and I thank you very much for coming. And welcome to the 2014 Forum, Leaders Nursing Voice for Change. New Brunswick's entering a highly political time with the upcoming provincial election on September 22nd, as you know, and the election gives us a unique opportunity to raise the visibility of our profession and engage those with political aspirations, sharing our expertise and views concerning our health system and health services. Before we start the session, I would just like to remind you that if you have translation devices, English is channel 1 and the French is channel 2. If you've not picked up a headset, they're just outside the door. You've received a session kit while registering this morning. This session, I should remind you, is being recorded and it'll be available on NANB website in about 3 weeks. A health and nutrition break will be after the keynote presentation, and staff will be available during the break should you require any assistance. In respect of our speakers and colleagues, if you would please turn off your electronic devices. If you're like my children, I know it's like removing your arm, but please, if you wouldn't mind, shut them off. And there will be a question and answer session following our keynote speaker presentation. As well, we will have a panel presentation focusing on election priorities and political influence, and there will be a question and answer period after that as well. So it's my great pleasure to introduce Shari Graydon, who's here with us today. Shari is the founder and catalyst of Informed Opinions and an award-winning author, educator, and women's advocate with more than 20 years of experience. A former newspaper columnist, TV producer, and commentator for CBC Radio and TV. She also served as a press secretary to a provincial premier. As president of Media Watch, Shari is a proud alumnus of the University of British Columbia and Fraser University, where she also taught. She's published 2 best-selling media literacy books for youth on advertising strategies and beauty and body image issues. She also received the Governor General's Award in commemoration of the Persons Case in 2007 and was named one of Canada's top 100 most powerful women by WXN in 2006. Please join me in welcoming Shari Graydon.
Thank you very much, Darlene, and thank you very much for having me here in the first place. It's a genuine honor for me to be speaking to you today. I have a special relationship with nurses. My best friend and my most enduring role model are both members of your profession. There we go. Norma Graydon. My mother was extremely proud of her nurse's training and the use she put to it for the duration that she was able to. But in 1959, as she lay on a gurney in the emergency room of a hospital in Montreal, listening to her blood drip onto the floor, her nurse's training was not helping her. Beside her, my father was reassuring her that everything would be fine, that she would be fine, and he was dismissing my mother's attempt at deathbed advice as she told him that he had to remarry. This infuriated her that he was not paying attention to her because she, with her medical knowledge, had understood the tense conversations that were going on around her in the emergency room. She knew that the sudden blood condition she had was that had in fact caused her to lose a baby at 8 months, just a month shy of its birth, was also likely to kill her. And in fact, she had a near-death experience. She saw white light at the end of the proverbial tunnel. She felt an incredibly warm, peaceful feeling come over her. It was very seductive, but she was, in fact, already a mother. She had 3 daughters. We were all under the age of 4. And so she dragged herself back from that seductive white light And she turned to my father and she summoned every last ounce of strength she had, and she said, "You're not listening to me. You need to marry again. My girls need a mother." The good news is her prognosis was wrong, and she did in fact survive, probably because she was afraid my father would not actually find a suitable replacement. 54 years later, blind, almost deaf, and living a very confined life, 2 weeks ago, my mother nevertheless correctly diagnosed my father's acute appendicitis, 84, who knew, and badgered him again, successfully this time, into going to the hospital, which probably saved his life. I tell you this just so you appreciate the measure of awe and respect that I feel for not just my mother, but nurses, and not just nurses, but women and all health professionals who insist on being heard about the knowledge they have that has an impact on the well-being of others. Unlike my mother, I have no head for science. I stopped taking biology, physics, and chemistry the minute I possibly could, and instead have studied communications, English, and theater. But I am my mother's daughter, in that I am very clear about the need to share and insist on being heard when I have information that is of importance to the well-being of others. And I'm here today to encourage you to channel your best role models to do the same. I'm going to start with a little bit of context for why this is critical in a bigger picture perspective. A few years ago, my husband and I were walking across the parking lot of a Catholic church in Montreal. A TV crew approached us and said, "The Pope has just died. Would you care to comment?" And I said, "No, I don't think so," and kept walking. From behind me, my husband, who had not been to church in 40 years, said, "Sure, I'll comment." I turned around stunned, wondering what pearls of wisdom were going to drop from his beautiful mouth. He bowed his head and he solemnly declared, "It's a very sad day for Catholics everywhere." And that made the national news. As we continued on our walk, I turned to him and said, "You know, that was kind of obvious, wasn't it? And wouldn't it be great if the next pope were to come up with a progressive policy on contraception that wouldn't disenfranchise millions of impoverished Catholic women around the world? Wouldn't that be worth saying?" And he said, "Yeah, Shari, exactly." He said, "Yeah, too bad you turned down the interview." And the thing is, I know better because for years I've been working in and around the media. The problem is that I'm not alone. Many women frequently decline to share their informed perspective, even when given the opportunity. And that's why, even though women dominate professions like yours, women in fact represent 60% of university grads these days, in the most influential opinion fora in the media, on talk shows, on newspaper comment pages where people with informed opinions get to weigh in, women's voices are outnumbered by men's by a ratio of about 4 or 5 to 1. And I'm asking you, does this make sense? That we're drawing on the talents and the brain power of only 50% of the population when it comes to analyzing and commenting on important issues of the day. I'm asking you, wouldn't we benefit from a little bit more Lang and a little bit less O'Leary? Yes, we would. And it's not just me who thinks so. You're probably aware of recent developments in neuroscience and the sophisticated ability we increasingly have to monitor activity in different parts of the brain, and what this is telling us about the ways in which men's and women's brains differ. Now, the debate is still out as to whether that's innate, genetic, or in fact socialized, but the fact remains that women bring different skills and aptitudes and orientations to the way we operate in the world. Women are more inclined to, this research shows, consult and reflect and consider consequences, while men are more inclined to assert, decide, take risks. And the point is, we really need both. In scientific research, in corporate governance, in senior management, in corporate and scientific environments, there's a growing body of research that makes clear the impact of including more women's perspectives and knowledges and approaches. It's profound. Gender-balanced teams do better scientific research. For example, men tend to maximize gain and minimize risk, while women tend to probe unexpected findings for the reasons. Men are more inclined to change their methodological strategy. And again, both are useful. Working together, we do better science. In corporations, the ethical standards go up, the profits go up, the work-life balance policies are better, all sorts of things improve when women are also at the table. Let me give you a concrete example of how this works in the world I've worked in for many years in the media. So I wrote a column for 3 years for the Vancouver Sun, and one day above the fold on page 3, very prominent position in the newspaper, this headline appeared. And I looked at the story and I thought, really, don't we already know that? Doesn't everybody already know that women only make 76 cents on the dollar? And why is this news today? But when I read the article, what it was actually about was the fact that if you had to count up and pay for all of the work that women do in the home and in their communities as volunteers, that number, if you had to pay for it, would be the equivalent of 40% of the gross domestic product of the country. And I think if I'd written the headline, I'd have mentioned that. The male headline writer who assigned this headline to the story wasn't intending to denigrate women's experience. Headline writing is a very challenging task. You get 5 minutes to read the story and then add the 5 to 7 words that will actually fit into the available space. But he was a guy, and he read the story and he framed it in the way that made sense to him. And clearly it makes a difference to what gets covered, how it gets covered, what we consider priorities, how we spend money, when only 1/2 of the population is telling most of the stories. And so the absence of women's perspectives is a problem. Because our life experiences are often profoundly different. Going back to my Pope story for a minute, when you think about it, most adult women spend 3 decades of our lives either trying to get pregnant, trying to avoid getting pregnant, or dealing with the consequences of having been pregnant, which last forever. And so it's not surprising that our perspectives on all sorts of things would be slightly different from men, as engaged as they may be in raising children as well. On top of that, we're also more fearful in underground parking lots or on dark streets. We're more likely to end up poor. And we are much, much more likely to be judged on the basis of our inability to live up to punishing appearance standards. It's interesting, however, that when women do have a voice, they tend to focus on things that don't get as much coverage as when they don't. So this word cloud that you're looking at represents the subjects that came up most often in the first 100 newspaper commentaries that were written by women I trained over the first year or so of the Informed Opinions project, which I now lead. And so I took women from across the country who were expert in a variety of fields, and then when they did translate their knowledge into short-form newspaper pieces and get them published with our help, these are the kinds of things that came up most often. And I can tell you that if you take a similar number of commentaries written by men who currently dominate those spaces, many of these words don't show up. And so this is part of what gets missing when women's voices are absent. Given your own levels of seniority and experience and abilities. I'm sure many of you get called from time to time and invited to speak, if not to the media, on a panel, at a conference. How many of you, in responding to any of those requests, have ever used these words? I'm really not the best person. How many have ever said those words? Okay, you're an unusually, either you're not raising your hands because you're too embarrassed to, or you're just an unusually forthright group of women. Because what I hear from women across the country in business and academia, that those words often come to women's minds. I myself have said them, and there are understandable reasons for that. We rarely are the best person, but there rarely is, in fact, one best person. And you may not find this surprising, but journalists will tell you that those words, I'm really not the best person, they rarely come from men's mouths. And it's not because all men think they are the best person. It's more that men think when they're asked to speak, well, do I have relevant experience in this field? Yes, of course I do. That's why you're calling me. So given my experience and my education, sure, I'm happy to talk to you. Women, on the other hand, often think of the three people who know that particular issue better than she does, and then we suggest that the journalists go to them. What that means, however, is that the journalist will simply go to the next person on his or her Rolodex, and the chances are that will be a guy, because men are generally more willing to talk to media and put themselves out there than we are. But I would suggest, given the centuries of silence behind women, and given the oppression of women internationally, and given the knowledge that you have as nurses, male and female, that when someone approaches you and asks you to speak up, that's an opportunity. And when women in particular turn down the opportunity, that's a sad day for women everywhere. The truth is that gender bias remains the water in which we swim. It still permeates many aspects of our culture, and every system or organization with any history behind it that was built and designed by and for men, men and the orientation of men remains the default. And their energy and orientation is critically important, but ours, to the extent that it's been missing in action, is still a problem. And because of that systemic water in which we swim, women are still judged unfairly, not only by others, but often by ourselves. And that's why, for example, even though Hillary Clinton is incredibly smart, articulate, competent, hardworking, as Secretary of State of the United States of America, she was probably among the best approved politician in the hemisphere. She had such high ratings. And yet she still got criticized and dissed for her hair and her makeup and her pantsuits. Often watching her, I would wonder, given how much she has been subjected to that kind of irrelevant criticism and condemnation, I often wonder how she manages to keep going, to keep putting herself out there. And I think at the end of the day, she's a classic example of what motivates many women who do in fact seek power. And the power they're seeking is not power over, it's power to make change. She's drawn by something bigger than herself. When her husband was president, she was drawn and driven to try and implement a health care act that was radical and rejected, but nevertheless needed. As Secretary of State, she championed maternal mortality around the world and other things related to equality. She knows that the criticism is not about her, and that's lucky for all of us, because we desperately need more fully clothed female role models. You know what I'm talking about. As long as images like these ones dominate in the media, it's not that there's a dearth of women, images of women in the media. There are lots of images of women in the media. It's just that there's not a lot of clothes on the women in the media. And as long as what we're looking at most of the time are unusually beautiful, often, remarkably airbrushed and sometimes surgically altered images of women, these are the ones against which we are all judged and found wanting. Now, it's not that there aren't other role models, especially around nursing. I'm going to date myself here, but I grew up reading Cherry Ames. And you still find Cherry Ames books? Do people still read Cherry Ames books? Yes? No? Maybe there's a new version. But any profession that has been traditionally dominated by women necessarily still struggles with the baggage of female stereotypes and expectations. So women have long been socialized to be nice, to avoid confrontation, to wait to be noticed and rewarded. And if and when we depart from that, like Hillary Clinton or Alison Redford, we very quickly get labeled pushy and bitchy and shrill. Fortunately, there are other role models of nurses in the media. Now, I'm not suggesting that Jackie's pharmaceutical dependence is anything to emulate, but she is a fierce, fierce advocate. A recent analysis of TV nurses described her as someone who expertly assesses patients, takes bold, innovative action, and she and other nurses on the show are bright, complex health professionals who push back against physician error. So clearly a valuable role model. Here's another role model you may not be familiar with. Her name is Vigdis Finnbogadottir. Her mother was also a nurse. Vigdis was for 16 years the president of Iceland. And that meant that an entire generation of Icelandic kids grew up only knowing a female president. When she retired in 1996, she was apparently watching television with her grandson, and they were profiling on the news the male candidates who were running to succeed her. And her grandson turned to her at a moment and said, "But grandmother, they can't be president, they're men." And so this is the power of role modeling, not just to make female leadership conceivable, but in fact to make it inevitable. Most of our own role modeling opportunities will be much more modest than President of Iceland or Secretary of State, but we can still have an impact. 24 years ago, I was a seriously underemployed graduate student at Simon Fraser University, and I had just joined the board of Media Watch as a volunteer, and the local television station called me up and said, "The Miss Canada pageant has just been canceled, and we need somebody to come on to talk about it who is not a beauty contestant." Okay, they didn't exactly say it like that, but that's what they meant. So I qualified. I was happy to go on. I had worked in public relations before, so I knew about, marshaling my thoughts into a soundbite. I went on camera and I said how happy I was that a contest that essentially treated women's bodies like steers at a cattle auction was no longer popular enough to attract an audience. And they used my quote on the news, and shortly after it aired, my ordinarily supportive mother was on the phone, and she said, "Honey, you looked awful." For the record, I did not look awful. I'd like to think that it was my mother's first clue that despite my many charms, I was, at 30 years old, not beauty contestant material. And the reason that was so evident to her was because my 10-second clip was wedged between 10 seconds of Miss Canada 1990 and 10 seconds of Miss Canada 1991. In addition to being a decade younger than me and sporting an inch of makeup, they were both demonstrably beauty queens. But the reason I tell you the story is that I had a lot more to say than the 10 seconds. And so I took the rest of what I felt and knew about the damage done to women in the media and channeled it into a newspaper commentary. And the only reason I knew how to do that, or knew to do that, was that my husband had recently written one, I had edited it, made it immeasurably better, and when it got published, I realized, okay, this is not rocket science, I can do this too, and so can you. We have resources on our website that will tell you how. In any case, I published the commentary, I got all sorts of feedback, I got other invitations to speak to other media. That only emboldened me. I started writing more commentary. I submitted to CBC Radio and television, and every significant career opportunity I have had in the last 24 years have come about as a result of having a public voice. And more importantly than that is that it's become very clear to me that it's much easier to get your telephone calls returned, to get people to give money to the causes that you believe in, to convince people to make change that you think is important if you have a public voice. A few years ago, a TV station in Ottawa, where I now live, called me up and wanted somebody to come on to debate the dubious merits of a beer commercial. So I went on television and I said, predictably, what probably many of you could say, and that is that, you know, when you use scantily clad women in a beer commercial and you have voyeuristic camera angles panning their bodies up and down, that's really not a good thing for women to be sexually objectified, particularly in a culture where the incidence of alcohol-infueled date rape is high and deeply problematic. When I returned home, I received an email from a woman by the name of Jennifer. She's an artist in Toronto. This is one of her paintings, and Jennifer was effusive to me in expressing her deep, profound gratitude for seeing me say the things that I had said on television. And she told me that for the past 10 years, she had been trying to paint her way out of the pain that she experienced as a 17-year-old at a party when she was gang raped by a group of men who she knew. With Jennifer's, and so she added, she said, you know, I would never be able to go on television or speak even anywhere in public and say what you did, but I so appreciated hearing my reality expressed. With her permission, one more point about that, because what she said was, the reason I would never be able to go on television is that every time I see a beer commercial like the one you talked about, or an image like this one, ubiquitous in fashion magazines, that somehow implies that violence is an integral part of sex, every time I see these images, I relive the gang rape. With Jennifer's permission, I removed the identifying information on her email and I forwarded it to the advertising executive who had appeared on the television program with me. And to his credit, he responded. He essentially said, "Oh my God." And he told me that he had a 2-year-old daughter and he had never ever made the connection between images of women in the media and the real impacts on women's lives. And he said he would never ever create another campaign that used women's bodies in a sexualized way now that he understood how problematic and irresponsible and dangerous it was to his daughter. Award-winning journalist Sally Armstrong, who I'm proud to say is an honorary patron of Informed Opinions, released a book last year called Ascent of Women. And in it she talks about the fact that if you can't speak about something, there's no way to change it. So anytime you can speak up, anytime you're given the opportunity to talk about anything that reflects the realities of your work life, nurses' challenges, the healthcare system, or women's needs, here's where I'm going to encourage you to start. I'd be happy to try to help. So those words, I'm not the best person, you're never going to start there again. I'd be happy to try to help. This doesn't say, yes, I'm the best person. It just says, I know something, let's start to have a conversation in which your experience-informed opinion as a woman, as a nurse, as a man, as a nurse, may have the capacity to add value. British author Virginia Woolf famously pointed out that for most of history, Anonymous was a woman. You know all those quotes you come across, they're attributed to Anonymous? Likely a woman. There were reasons for that, circumstances that kept us silent and unable to be heard, unable to speak. We didn't have a room of one's own, in Virginia Woolf's words. But that's no longer the case. Now, increasingly, many of us do, and as a result, we're judges and CEOs and heads of state. But you don't need the corner office to make a difference by speaking up. These ordinary women from Kenya, from Canada, from Northern Ireland, all achieved extraordinary things for the environment, for the homeless, and for peace. Do you ever feel reluctant to stand up at a microphone in a room like this because you don't want to look stupid? You're afraid that the question you ask is, you're not going to articulate it fully enough. You're a little nervous. You don't want to be criticized. Does anybody ever have that experience? I also have that experience often, even though I speak all the time. When I speak at this mic, I'm prepared. I've thought about it. I'm pretty sure I have something worth saying. At the mic, when I don't have that time to think on the floor, I'm more nervous. Whenever I notice myself being stopped by fears of looking stupid or not being perfect or not getting it right, I think about the fact that, like you, I am one of the most privileged human beings on the planet. I'm educated. I have a job. I'm relatively affluent. I live in Canada. And I think if we're unwilling to speak up, sometimes for fear of embarrassment, minor embarrassment, what about Malala Yousafzai? This is a young woman who risked her life as a teenager to speak up for education for girls. And I think that my comfort makes me complacent, and that I am ashamed of my own cowardice in the face of her heroism. This week, the news coverage of the young man in Isla Vista who murdered 6 people with guns and knives. I was driving from north of Toronto to Toronto earlier this week, listening to the news coverage on the radio. And one of the women who was commenting on it said, you know, violence doesn't have a nationality, it doesn't have religion, it doesn't have a race, but it does actually have a gender. And all men are not violent, but all women are afraid and subjected to the harassment or the fear and the behavior that changes because we're nervous in underground parking lots. And so it's time for all of us, women and the men, most of whom aren't violent, to be speaking up more often about the things we know and care about and the change we'd like to see made. And in fact, women have spoken up often, even when they didn't have power. We didn't get the vote by declining to speak or deferring to others. We didn't get sexual assault laws. We didn't get maternity leave. We didn't get many of the privileges that we have today by waiting to be noticed and waiting to be perfect and waiting to ensure we had all our ducks in the row before we stepped up to the mic. And we don't get to be at the decision-making tables or influence the outcome of elections by fearing criticism or deferring to others. Here's what Kim Campbell, also an honorary patron of Informed Opinions, says about power. Someone has to have it. If you would exercise it ethically, why not you? An American author, Alice Walker, points out that the most common way people give up power is by believing that they don't have any. I know the power that nurses wield when you have to, when you're advocating for a child, when you're rushing to save a patient's life. You insist that other medical personnel pay attention to you, to listen to the critical information that you have. I have seen my mother in action in those circumstances. I was in the hospital myself in Vancouver in 1984. I had an undiagnosed ruptured ovarian cyst. I had referred pain in my shoulder. I thought I was dying. It was 4 in the morning. My mother rushed 2 communities over to come to the hospital, and when she walked onto that emergency ward and started asking questions, my husband overheard one medical professional say to another, "Is she chief of staff?" Because that's the energy and insistence she was manifesting in support of making sure I got the attention I needed. I'm urging you to channel that energy. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much, Shari. Now that we'll open the mics for questions, I just would like to remind people if you'd identify yourselves at the mic if you have a question for Shari. We have time to have a little bit of open discussion in respect to the presentation or any other question you may have for Shari based on the expertise you've seen today with her resume. So.
Somebody has to come up to that microphone because that's what I just heard.
Yes, exactly. So thank you, yes. Microphone number 3.
Hi, Dawn Torpy. I'm a staff member at NANB. You made reference in your talk this morning to a website and tools and information that we could use to increase the power of our voice. Could you share a little bit more about that?
Yes. So
Sure.
the organization is called, can you hear me? So the organization is called Informed Opinions. If you just Google that, the URL is www.informed-opinionsplural.org. And the resources section of the website has many of the materials that we use in the workshops. And in the workshops, what we do is take women who have knowledge like you do and help them figure out how to take this much information and marshal it into a 700-word piece that's publishable in your local newspaper. And we also have the email addresses and the word counts for most of the major dailies in the country. But if the paper in your community isn't listed on our submissions page, you can simply call up the paper and say, can you tell me how long op-ed pages or commentary pieces should be, and who do I send them to? Yes, second question.
Hello, my name is Lucille Offrey, and in approximately 6 or 7 months, we'll be living a provincial election here in New Brunswick, and hopefully, in about 1.5 years, not that I'm showing my colors, but we'll have a federal election. Now, I think the federal government has been very successful in removing health from all visible signs in Canadian life. We have many issues, but there is a decreased transfer payments to the provinces, which affect provinces like New Brunswick. And we have much to say. And we need to rekindle a passion underneath Canadians for articulating distress with the lack of action on health and social issues. Where do we begin to reposition this agenda in a constructive way? We can't have it all, but we have an ability to move the yardstick in Canada, and we deserve to have at least pharmacare and support for our young and our elderly in Canada. So where do we begin?
First of all, I fully agree with the premise of your question, and we will have an election next year. It's on the books. There's no way to avoid it. That's the good news. And I'm really happy to have been working with and seeing what your organization is actually doing already in preparation for this fall's election here in New Brunswick. And the next hour or so are going to be looking specifically at that. And I'm going to come back and talk at the end for 20 minutes about some concrete specific strategies about engaging in that conversation and the kinds of things that you all can do. So thank you for pointing out the urgency of that. And I would say that it's shared across the country I speak with thousands of women every year. I was in Toronto a week or so ago and met with the head of the Mars Discovery District at the University of Toronto. And this is a woman who's involved in innovation and science, but she said to me, Shari, what can we do to get more women voting? Don't you think that that would have a huge impact on which government we elect and what got put on the table as priorities? And I'm absolutely convinced that the reason we pay less attention to healthcare and education and social justice issues is because women's voices are so underrepresented. Other comments or questions? You should all be rushing those mics.
I know. We're going to try to create some momentum
I know
here.
the minute we turn off the mics and we take the break, you're all going to have lots to say to each other.
I would like you to comment, Shari, if you could, Roxanne Tarjan, the ED of NANB. I think sometimes it's overwhelming to think about writing op-eds and being in the media. And one of the things we've been reflecting at about NANB is that nurses live in communities. They have neighbors. They have families. They know the local politicians. They know the influential. So could you talk a little bit about using your voice in that domain and sharing your knowledge so people get a broader view of reality than the one that's out in the media?
Mm-hmm. So I'm not giving up on you engaging with the media, but let me just say that every time you have a conversation with the checkout clerk or the taxi driver or the postie or your neighbor across the fence, that's an opportunity to move from the weather to something that's more critically important, to talk about the realities that you're living, the perspectives that you have, informed by the critically important work that you're doing, work that is even more critically important as the population ages. So I think really putting your hat on and thinking about, like, keeping that metaphorical nurse's cap on. You probably don't ever wear nurse's caps anymore, but just imagine it sitting on your head when you're out in the community talking with whoever. Yeah.
I'm Brenda Kinney. I'm president-elect for the Nurses Association. Shari, as you noted, we are a predominantly female profession, and the medical profession certainly, up to maybe the last few years, is predominantly male. So we automatically have a gender inequality or imbalance, I should say, within our professions. One of the things that I'm wondering is, yes, I think nurses do stand up when it becomes an issue for their patient, but in the broader spectrum, I would say they tend to defer to the voice of the physician, for example, or if there's a profession that it still has the predominantly male. I'm just wondering what your thoughts are on how we as a profession can get our opinions out there in a more forceful manner.
So, you know, really, that is a big part of the issue. And I know, and I'm going to talk at the end in my last 20 minutes specifically about doctors and nurses and what I found. I had a conversation with André Picard a year or so ago, asked because he's somebody who has an informed opinion about that as well. And I think it's a switch, a mental switch that you could and should all make. And, you know, maybe an exercise to do would be to take a piece of paper, put a line down the center of it, and on one side, write down all the things that you as nurses deal with, draw attention to, focus on, and then make check marks beside those issues on the other side of the paper if they're ones that doctors raise. Because my guess is that there's probably some overlap, but there are probably all sorts of things that if you're not voicing those concerns, doctors are not voicing them. And so if you're deferring to letting doctors speak, they're not on the agenda. And there are twice as many of you, twice as many of you as there are doctors. And what have you got to be afraid of? More of the same. That's what you've got to be afraid of, more of the same. Yeah.
Hi, Rhonda Shattuck. I just have a comment to make, and over the course of the last few years of my career, I've read Suzanne Gordon's books advocating for nurses not being silent anymore. She's a journalist. Yourself advocating for us to find our voices as well. I was at a national leadership convention a few years ago where Gloria Steinem spoke, and her message was, don't look at me as, you know, being a feminist. Look at me as someone who has found her voice and wishes it for you. And how do we teach our frontline nurses that principle? Because they are overworked. They're coping with multiple loads of, you know, work at with their children, with community, and with other relationships and at work, and they're tired.
Mm-hmm. I understand that reality, and I really appreciate the degree to which those multiple roles that women continue to hold are one of the significant barriers to why women have not engaged and still decline opportunities. I don't have children of my own. I've been self-employed much of my adult life. I've had the luxury of volunteering and engaging in a way that I know is difficult for others. And so not every woman can do it all the time. But there are some specific, small, concrete things that every woman can do. How often do you watch the news or read something in the media that relates in some way to your realities, and it makes you mad because they're missing information, or the angle is wrong, or you just think, no, that's not right, or you should be doing. How many of you have that experience? Email makes it unbelievably easy to respond when you feel that way. And so, you know, test your thermometer and notice when your blood pressure is rising, and rush to your smartphone and email somebody who can do something about it. Email a reporter, a columnist, a journalist, a politician, a political party, a newspaper, a TV station, and say, you know, what the, and share what you think. So that alone, that's a very small thing. And even if all of you, even if every nurse in New Brunswick did something like that once during the election, it would probably be exponentially more interventions than happened in the previous election. That's my guess.
Hi, I just had one other comment, maybe question, and you might be going to address it later when we get to the political forum, but recently the board members have had opportunity to have some interaction with the politicians in the province, looking forward towards an election, as well as having been invited to meet with the Premier and Minister of Health. Invariably, the questions that they are putting to us are, what can we do? How can we affect the change that we know needs to be made? And I'm talking about primary health care and the improvement to access for our patients, our citizens in New Brunswick. But how they wanted us to tell them, how do we affect that change when we're dealing with a very powerful medical society? And we're telling them what needs to be done. We've been telling them, I would say, for many, many years, but they're not really hearing that voice. And you might have just answered that. Maybe it's the swell that we have to have from every person that has an issue with that, so that the politicians are knowing there is some other support out there for some of those actions. Anyway, just a comment.
So that's a really good point. Numbers count. As president of Media Watch, one of our goals was to change the way women and girls were portrayed in the media. I can't say that we were very successful when you look at the environment today, but one of the things we determined was that when one woman wrote, or man, when one person complained to a magazine or a television station about something that they found offensive or inappropriate, the television station or media outlet would assume that he or she spoke for 100 people. And so if that alone helps you speak up, it's important to do that. If you don't speak at all, there's no problem from their perspective. Two other things I would just quickly say, and one is that making the issue always about something bigger than yourselves is critically important, and I think it's what drives women in the first place. But that's the part that you need to keep front of mind, is that I'm not doing this for me. Yes, of course, these changes would make my life easier, my hospital run more smoothly, my patients better, but really you need to, in Sheryl Sandberg's words, act personally but think communally, because every individual action has potential ripples and makes a bigger difference. And the last thing I would say about politicians, I just learned this last week at the Academic Congress. There was a lobbyist in the room who regularly lobbies politicians on behalf of his organization, and he said when you're speaking to politicians, basically you need to think grannies, puppies, and babies. So you got those three images in your mind? This is going to help you remember. The grannies is you need to make what you're talking about really accessible, because they're politicians, they're not health professionals. So that's the grannies part. The puppies is you need to speak to them on a heart level. You need to let them know why people should care, because there are only votes for them if people care. So you need to tell stories that make clear why people should care about whatever aspect of the healthcare system you're wanting to change. And the babies is to think about future impact. So what is the future? What are the future consequences of not doing this? And what is the future upside of making the change that you're wanting to make? Yes.
Good morning. My name's Diane Murray, and I'm a nurse here in Fredericton, and I would just ask that you indulge me for a moment. I want to tell you that in Fredericton last week, we lost one of the most, I think, influential nurses. Ethel Duplessis died. Ethel was never a manager. She was never probably sat in forums like many of us have, but she was an influential leader. She practiced nursing for 44 years. She was a farm wife at that time. She was not afraid to call the CBC and tell them what she thought. Her politicians knew her by name, but also her community knew her by name. They knew that they could depend upon her. They knew that she was thoughtful and well-read. And those of us who knew her, our hearts broke because we knew that a leader was lost. And I guess what I want to know is, how can I become an Ethel? And how can I inspire young people? Because I think a lot of them are feeling bewildered and belittled at times, that the problems are their fault, that they're not the solution. But first of all, I'd like for you to think about someone like Ethel that you know, and I just wanted to remember her today, because for those of us who knew her, she was an example of what an exceptional nurse was. But I want to know, how do I inspire young people to become that nurse?
Thank you, first of all, for sharing that. You know, Malala Yousafzai, Alice Walker, Malala Yousafzai, Hillary Clinton, Vigdis Finnbogatir, none of those are remotely as powerful as role models as somebody in your community whose actions you witness up close every day and whose impact you're able to see. What a thing for politicians in her community to know her name. That speaks volumes. And that alone, you could all take that as a goal. During this election campaign, I'm going to make sure that the candidate most likely to win in my riding knows my name. Because then once they're elected, I'm going to approach them again, because then they'll actually have power to do something about that. That alone, if you all did that, that would be awesome. So I think really you've just made the very point, and that is to channel someone who you admire, who you have seen doing exactly these kinds of things, calling up the CBC, meeting with politicians, lobbying, and you don't have to be a ball breaker to do that. What do they say? You catch more flies with honey. I mean, you can be bees. You can be forceful and a strong advocate and respectful and friendly and productive and constructive at the same time. And I know you all do that in the roles that you perform every day professionally. I know you do that. And so it's just stepping outside of the hospital or the clinic or the office and manifesting that same take charge, get her done, lives at stake energy that you operate on most of your working days. Thank you very much.
Thank you.